Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. We're diving back into one of our favorite channels today. This is Extra History, and they've had an ongoing series of videos that they'll do one for every so often about historical tyrants. And so we're going to take a look at one of those today. This is Herod the Great. If you are like me and you grew up in the church, you grew up hearing all about Herod. Different Herods, two of them, in fact. Herod the Great being the one that gets talked about the most, that is associated with the birth story of Jesus. But there's a lot more to the story than just what appears in the New Testament. He has a big connection to the Roman Empire, especially to the time of the triumvirate, the second triumvirate, and then later to the empire under Caesar Augustus. So I'll put the link down in the description. You can check it out without my commentary. This one came out about 2 weeks ago. Let's check out Herod the Great.
The Senate, Rome. Mark Antony and Octavian step forward to plead their case. The Roman-controlled province of Judea is restive, mired in civil conflict, and worst of all, has fallen under the sway of Rome's enemy, the Parthian Empire. Yet, they have a man who can bring peace and security. A man who has come from far away. His father was named governor after Pompey conquered Jerusalem. His family had been friends of Julius Caesar, allies of Cassius, and were long acquainted with Antony. He has diplomatic ties to Rome's Egyptian ally Cleopatra, and Antony attests to this man's ruthless ability to crush rebels.
Yeah, so this is important to note that Judea at this point, that province of Judea, the area that is generally kind of the nation of Israel, and of course the West Bank and Gaza today, Palestinian territory, that area. This hasn't been completely Roman for very long. And that's why when you get to the story of the New Testament, you see the tension that is described between the Romans and the Jewish authorities and the people. It's because it's only been a couple of generations at that point that have been under what they see as the oppression of Rome. And they are kind of a problem for the Roman Empire because they are out on the fringes. They are in this area where there's enemies not far away. There are religious issues, especially once the Romans start, putting up their symbols and things like that at the temple. So Herod is the perfect kind of figure for them because he's got a Roman mindset when it comes to how to deal with people, but he's also seen as one of them, right? He's Jewish, or at least acts like he's Jewish most of the time, at least publicly.
His talent at raising tax revenue, his political cunning and classical education. He is a man who can speak Greek and has trained in the Roman arts of war despite being culturally and religiously Jewish. A man who deserves, Antony says, no mere client governorship, but a throne. When the senators stand to vote, it is unanimous. They will recognize this man as King of the Jews, a man who will come to be respected and reviled, who the very Bible will cast as a villain, Herod the Great.
Yep.
But before we continue this tale, thank you so much to Private Internet Access for making sure we have great internet protection. Whew. Oh boy, you never really get used to it, do you, bud? Well, such is the life of a tyrant scene investigator, am I right? All right, boys, flip the sheet. Let's see what we got this week. Subject is Herod called the Great. Roman client king of Judea, claimed king of the Jews. Second monarch in the Herodian dynasty.
Yeah, so notice they say client king, right? This is a king, but he's not autonomous. He's not able to just do whatever he wants. He answers to Rome. And at this time, this is Rome before there's an empire. There's still, although, even the empire word is tricky because even when there were emperors, they kind of claimed it was still a republic and they were just the first, the princeps. But it was an empire, but we're not there yet.
Estimated date of reign 37 BCE to around 4 BCE. Boy, this is a messy one. Now, you probably know Herod as the villain of the Nativity story, the man responsible for the massacre of the innocents, where he ordered soldiers to kill all male children in Bethlehem under 2 years old.
Now, it's important to note that when we're talking about Bethlehem around this time, and the estimates of Jesus' birth are around that 4 BC time period, we're not talking about hundreds of kids, right? I mean, Bethlehem is just outside at the time of Jerusalem. It's really in Jerusalem at this point. It's if you look at Google Maps and look at a satellite view, you can't really tell where Bethlehem ends and Jerusalem begins because it's really close. But we're not talking about a lot of kids. I'm not trying to downplay it. I'm just saying that this wasn't something that would have been such a big deal that it would have been written down by a bunch of historians, right? We might be talking about a dozen or less. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it was 3 or 4 male babies under 2 years old in this town.
Guy who tried to murder Jesus. And not just any Jesus, mind you. We're talking like baby Jesus,
right.
AKA the cutest of the Jesuses, which ironically...
The cutest of the Jesuses.
Of all of his crimes, that's probably the one he's least likely to have actually committed. After all, only one of the 4 Gospels records this act, and the Roman Jewish historian Josephus, the main source on Herod's reign, doesn't even mention it.
And Josephus is writing a little bit later than the Gospels, or right about the same time as the Gospels, all of which are several generations after these events unfolded, right? So were there people that would have been aware of it that could have talked about it? Yeah, but there wouldn't be so many. If it did happen, if we're talking about, a dozen or less babies, if we're talking about maybe 3 or 4, there's not going to be a huge number of people to begin with who even knew this took place. And so it doesn't surprise me a whole lot that only Matthew talks about it. The Gospel of Matthew talks about it. And that doesn't necessarily mean it didn't happen. Just like a lot of things, whether it's in the Bible or in history, we're going to find that the sources are pretty thin on a lot of stuff.
Though this is not an exoneration, mind you. As you'll see in this investigation, Herod was entirely capable of horrible things.
Oh, yeah.
But contrary to his biblical reputation, when the Roman army, Octavian and Antony, gave Herod, besieged and entered Jerusalem, Herod's first instinct was actually to try and rein in the troops and prevent them from sacking the city, because that's exactly what happened when Pompey conquered the city a generation before.
Right, and it's not because Herod isn't capable and willing to do that kind of thing himself, but he understands that he's got to rule these people and he's got to have control of these people, and if this is how they start things out, it's going to be really, really difficult to kind of win the hearts and minds, so to speak.
His troops had looted the Temple Mount, and Pompey himself despoiled the Holy of Holies by entering the place where God was supposed to dwell. Though Herod's father had secretly passed information to Pompey and rode that Roman victory to power, Herod understood that the trauma it inflicted on Jerusalem's population was still playing out, and that if it happened again, he would never have a secure rule.
Yeah, exactly. And for those who aren't familiar with Jewish religion and how things work, the Holy of Holies was the innermost kind of sanctum of the temple. It was separated by this really thick curtain that very famously in the story of the crucifixion in the Gospels is torn from top to bottom to kind of symbolize that now God is accessible to everyone. Because at this time only the high priest could go in, and only once a year. And there are stories about them tying a rope around his ankle. That way, if he died when he went into the presence of God in the Holy of Holies, they could drag his body out because nobody else was supposed to go in there.
And establishing security was extremely important to him, because Herod's family had no traditional claim to the throne. Previously, the kings of Judea were from the line of David, a line he was not a part of. Indeed, many in Jerusalem would argue that he wasn't even fully Jewish.
And this is one of the reasons why, in the gospel account, he is going to see the birth of Jesus as a threat. Because, of course, number one, everybody knew that there were prophecies about a king coming from the line of David. And, of course, Jesus claiming descent from David, that's a threat.
He was born in present-day Jordan, an area not considered part of Judea, but that had been swept up by the Jewish Hasmonean dynasty ruling from Jerusalem. His ancestors were converts to Judaism, and debate continues over whether he was ethnically Jewish by descent, half Arab, or Arab on both sides. It was a fairly barren place, but one with major links to trade, and during Herod's youth was a borderland between Roman and Parthian territory. Herod was, therefore, raised religiously and culturally Jewish, but with the sort of philosophical, linguistic, and military education his father's Roman allies received. In his 20s, he cut his teeth as governor of Galilee, becoming famous for personally executing a bandit rebel who was a bit of a Robin Hood figure.
So Galilee is in the north. This is the area that Jesus is going to come from. And of course, Jordan is just to the east. And, all of this area is really small, right? I was looking at the map because by the time you guys watch this video, I'll actually be in Jordan. So when we're at the Dead Sea, we're only going to be and we're going to be in Jordan. We're only going to be 20 miles from Jerusalem.
That put him in line with his Roman allies, who dealt with rebels quite brutally, but pitted him against a council of Jewish priests, who traditionally were the ones that issued the death penalty. Called to trial, Herod showed up wearing imperial purple, a statement that he saw himself as one day being their ruler. That trial did not go great for anyone, really. The high priest was afraid to convict Herod, but also to exonerate him. So he adjourned the court and privately told Herod to get out of town until things died down. Decades later, when he took Jerusalem as a Roman client king, Herod would actually marry that high priest's granddaughter, Mariamne, who ended up in many ways becoming his path to legitimacy. Now, politically, Mariamne was the perfect bride for Herod. Through both of her family lines, she was connected to both of the civil conflicts that the Romans and Parthians had backed rival factions of, making her a unifying figure. Plus, with her as his bride, no one could question Herod's somewhat unusual bloodline. His children with her would be of the house of David, perfectly legitimate, and therefore he would be as well. Though,
as long as he keeps them alive. A little foreshadowing there.
It should be noted that before all that, he did have to exile his first wife, who, in one of those funny instances where a specific name is much older than you think, was named Doris. I thought it was old, but not this old. Anyway, Herod was very happy with his new, beautiful, high-class bride, Mariamne, for a while. Because here's the thing with Herod. Yes, he was ruthless from the beginning. Yes, he relentlessly eliminated threats to his rule. And yes, he always had a streak of arrogance and even vindictiveness. But all that was not unusual for a Roman or Jewish ruler of the time.
That's fair.
No, what really got to him was the paranoia. See, the Herodian line was always looked down on by a large number of Judea's citizens. Herod had to be the perfect Roman client to his allies, the perfect Jewish king to his subjects, and the perfect religious figure to the priests.
So, paranoia and fear. I talk about fear a lot in other settings other than YouTube, but fear is a powerful motivator. And I've often shared a simple story that illustrates this. Years ago, we saw on the news something about a bear being seen in the parking lot at Walmart. Now, where I live, we do occasionally have bear sightings, right? But it's not common, and they certainly don't appear very often in really high population areas. But this bear appeared in Walmart, and people talked about it, and it was on the news. And a little while later, I saw someone post on social media that they saw the same bear in the township park. Now, if you're looking at a map of the community, here's Walmart, and here's the park, and then here's my house. And so it looked like the bear was headed toward my house. And my youngest son, was 5 years old at the time. And I went outside and I yelled at him to get in the house, and he started crying because he thought he was in trouble. And I had to explain to him that he wasn't in trouble. I just didn't want him to get eaten by a bear. Now, we never saw the bear, but my fear of what could happen to my son led to my behavior and led to my actions. And fear motivates people to sometimes do things they might not otherwise do out of self-preservation, out of a degree of nervousness and just worried about what might happen if you don't act. And when you combine paranoia with power, it can be a dangerous combination.
And doing all that was fundamentally not possible. For example, when Herod was voted to be king of Judea, Antony insisted the decision be celebrated by a large-scale sacrifice of pigs at the Temple of Jupiter, an act that was almost calculated to inflame domestic opposition in Jerusalem.
Yep.
I mean, sacrificing to foreign idols and slaughtering unclean animals. Not a good look. Similarly, once Herod retook Judea, he ordered the usurper crucified, which was all well and good for the Romans, who considered the man a traitor, who collaborated with the Parthians, but it didn't go down well with the Judeans, who looked at crucifixion as a foreign punishment. He was always under a microscope, unable to please everyone, and, on top of that, people were very much out to get him. So I guess it's not paranoia? Well, let's see. His father had been poisoned at a banquet in his honor. Herod had the culprit assassinated by the Romans. One of his brothers had been imprisoned in a tall tower and driven to jump from its high window. Another of his brothers had been killed in battle and his body desecrated so they could not conduct Jewish funeral rites. Plus, he himself had been targeted by teams of assassins when he'd besieged Jerusalem with his Roman army. Okay, well, paranoia then might be the wrong word. But what it meant was...
Yeah, but the problem is that some of the people he goes after are some of the people closest to him in his own family.
Herod never really felt safe with anyone, at least apart from his sister Salome and his wife Mariamne. At least until his mother-in-law Alexandra and Mariamne pressured him to appoint Mariamne's 16-year-old brother high priest. Herod relented and came to regret it immediately. See, originally, the roles of king and high priest of Judea had been held by the same person, but over the years, that had separated. Though the high priest still had a bit of royal flair, and
They separated in part because there was no king anymore. After the exile in Babylon, you don't have Jewish kings.
from the celebrations in the street, it looked like, Herod's beloved wife and his mother-in-law had played him. Because everyone loved this young, handsome high priest with his unimpeachable royal bloodline, including Mark Antony and Cleopatra, who Mariamne had enlisted in the pressure campaign. Herod sensed a threat. And when he sensed a threat, his first move was to drown it in the bath. Literally. Because shortly after becoming high priest, Mariamne's brother went to his mother's swimming party and, drowned. Oh, gosh, that's terrible. Wait, what? No, it wasn't because Herod's bodyguards held him under. How dare you? They were trying to save him. Hey, and for the record, no one cried as loudly at the funeral as Herod did.
Right.
No one.
He was a politician. He had charm and charisma, but he also had ruthlessness and paranoia and power.
Got it? Great. After the episode, the only person Herod trusted anymore was his sister, who, to be clear, was also poisoning his mind against his wife. Because, why was she always recommending her relatives to high office, I wonder? I mean, was she plotting? And why had she become so cold to Herod, What, just because he'd killed her brother and sent their sons away to Rome? Come on. What's she really playing at here? Herod ordered Mariamne, previously the love of his life and claimed to his legitimacy, strangled to death, an act he also regretted almost immediately. Supposedly, he suffered a sort of mental breakdown after executing his chief wife. Ordering her body preserved in a great jar of honey, he slept with it next to his bed and opened it to stare at her beauty. Or perhaps, this was only his way of, again, being the loudest mourner at the funeral.
Right. I mean, that's the problem, is that when somebody can play the game and they can put on a show, it becomes difficult to know when it's real and when it's just for theater.
During this supposed mental breakdown, his mother-in-law tried to stage a coup, and he had her executed as well. But amid all this madness, Herod was also leading a building spree. During his capture of Jerusalem, the temple had...
Why? Why do you got to do this to me, Extra History? Every single video, you got to throw Walpole's name up there. I mean, you're killing me. You're killing me here.
Had been damaged. He rebuilt it, initiating the Second Temple period by erecting a structure far grander than before. The Western Wall, the most famous piece of ancient architecture in modern Jerusalem, is what remains of Herod's temple. erected by special priests who were also experts in masonry.
And really what the Western Wall is it's part of the platform on which the temple was built. When Jerusalem was destroyed by Titus in the late first century, the mid to late first century, around 70 AD, everything was just kind of thrown off of that platform, and so you don't really have much left.
He'd hoped this act would make his subjects happy. It did not. He then built a great mountaintop fortress and tomb for himself, the Herodium, which was one of the grandest mausoleums of the age. This was not his only fortress, but part of a string of defensive fortifications that included the Masada, which later played a major role in the Jewish revolt. Yet perhaps his greatest achievement was the city of Caesarea Maritima, a port city on the Mediterranean built on a coast with no natural bays or ports.
I said Caesarea, but the way he pronounced it is closer to Caesar. Kaiser is really kind of more about how Caesar's name would have been pronounced in Latin.
His architects erected a breakwater by dropping stones onto underwater concrete, sheltering the harbor, and naming it after his great ally Octavian, who by then had changed his name to Caesar Augustus. And it is to Herod's credit that he managed the transition from being Antony's ally to Octavian's, demonstrating his skill in managing Roman relationships to keep Judea within Rome's orbit.
So if you've ever seen HBO's Rome, which was a phenomenal show, only got 2 seasons. They had originally planned, I think, for 5 seasons, and this whole storyline with Herod was supposed to be a big part of the longer version of the show. They do introduce Herod in one episode, and they have a meeting between him and Antony, but it never goes anywhere because they have to kind of zip through everything in season 2.
Avoiding entanglement with the losing side of any civil war. However, focusing on keeping his Roman ally, he took a major hit to his domestic reputation when he installed Roman eagles on the Temple Mount and built a shrine to the worship of Octavian. These monumental works won him the title of the Great. Yet as Herod aged, his paranoia began to match that title. He recalled his first wife Doris with her sons, as well as his 2 sons with Mariamne, who'd been educated in Rome. Perhaps understandably, those boys had never really forgiven their father for killing their mother and, keeping her in a big honeypot. And believing themselves his rightful heirs, they became a little too loose with the gossip about his declining health and how they had to pretend to miss while hunting as not to appear better than him. Their loose tongues were an opening for his firstborn son and heir with Doris, Herod Antipater, to claim his half-brothers were plotting against their father. Herod had both of them strangled to death. 3 years later, however, Antipater was himself entangled in a plot and sentenced to death, though Octavian himself had to approve the execution. And after doing so, the first emperor of Rome quipped that it was better to be Herod's pig than his son, the joke being that at least kosher laws protected the pig. And my God, how do you get dunked on by someone who famously had no sense of humor? Towards the end of his life, the king was afflicted by an unknown condition, colloquially called Herod's evil. He seemed to rot from the inside out, his legs and groin going gangrenous. A rumor ran around Jerusalem that he had died, triggering a minor revolt. Though Herod was, in his own way, preparing for death. He drew up his will, splitting provinces between his many remaining sons, and he left his sister Salome with instructions to draw up all major political and religious figures in the kingdom, hold them hostage, and have them all executed when he passed away. She did not do that. When Herod passed, she released the hostages instead, knowing it would be better for Herod's heirs, who would need these figures to hold the kingdom together. Herod is, in some ways, a classic tyrant. Though he may not have been responsible for the massacre of the innocents, actually some theories suggest his son did this since it was more in his character, he certainly was not above massacring innocents. Though since this story very much mirrors an infant killing that Pharaoh orders in Exodus, it also may simply be a literary device. After all, accusing one's enemies of killing babies was an established tactic for vilification by then. The Old Testament accuses pagans of doing it. The Romans would accuse the Christians of it. Christians would accuse Jews of it, and then witches of it. And of course, history marches on with the Satanic Panic and Comet Pizza and J.D. Vance, etc., etc. Yet you can see where his reputation in the Bible comes from. The power politics of Judea essentially drove Herod to a kind of paranoid madness, one that cinched his circle of trusted people smaller and smaller. And
it certainly does not make him unique in that. I mean, obviously, you can probably sense the parallels with Henry VIII, for example, and many other people throughout history. Saddam Hussein, Joseph Stalin, many people saw enemies within the camp and dealt with them.
His subjects, to his court, to his allies, to his family, until finally the circle consisted only of one, himself. And it turned out that delusional, jaded, and in pain, he could not trust himself either. Herod shows us what life becomes when you see enemies everywhere, real and imagined, and how that can make...
And sometimes in imagining enemies and dealing with them, you create real ones. It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy at that point.
Someone, a villain of biblical proportions.
All right, as always, good stuff. Obviously, for me personally, my background being... with both history but also the Bible. I kind of weave a lot of my knowledge of the biblical accounts into that. But there's certainly a lot of the historical accounts outside the Bible as well, so especially from guys like Josephus. So let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below, and we will see you again soon. Thanks for watching.